Today, we're blessed to have Malcolm Hoenlein, to get his insights and to be able to ask him questions today. And if I could just step back about 35 years ago, 40 years ago, there were two people against everyone else. There were two people that warned the world about what a radical religious Islamic world meant. One of them was the famous Professor Bernard Lewis at Princeton, the preeminent Islamic historian and theologian. And the other was Malcolm Hoenlein, who spoke to American Jews, who spoke to the White House, who spoke to the Senate and the Congress. Not everyone wanted to listen, but the reality is that Malcolm was not 100%, but 110% correct in what he envisioned 35, 40 years ago, what we're dealing with both from a point of view of Shia Islam and Sunni Islam, what Christian Europe is going to have to deal with and what America is dealing with. And without further ado, we want to introduce someone who's been an incredible friend, not only to the Jewish world, not only to Israel, but a friend to all of Western civilization, Malcolm Hoenlein.
Wow, thank you. The truth is, I agreed to do this broadcast being in Jerusalem only to get your introductions, which are always the best. And I'm proud to call you a friend and to have been involved with FIDF for many decades, but never felt more strongly about it and all the efforts to support our soldiers and the families, their needs, than I am now. And I know there's been a great response, but the responses are going to have to continue for all of us. I think for all of world Jewry and for many others, October 7th was a watershed that will go down in history like few other memorable dates, maybe 9/11 in America. But I would say October 7th had an even more profound impact and will have a longer term impact. We see how many people who had marginal associations with the Jewish community now stepping up and taking on the colleges that have been discriminating against Jews and allowing antisemitism to be fomented with no response, so much so that their presidents couldn't even say that calling for the genocide of Jews would violate their college standards, let alone many other things that they said, which didn't get reported, including that none of them would declare that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state was something that they accepted. But this is not new. This has been going on for years, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I think the fact that people of renown are now identifying with the Jewish community, as well as grassroots, people who had no synagogue membership or other associations, recognize today how important associating with the community, how important Israel is, how the IDF is fighting for all of us, that what's at stake, and an argument we've made for many years, is that this isn't just about Israel's security, it's about America's security, it's about the region. And it's certainly, when they say that they want to kill, they don't just mean Israelis, they mean all of us. So I think that there is a profound change taking place, and we have to adapt to it. We have to see how we can encourage it and direct it in positive and constructive ways. I, for one, think there will be a big aliyah after this war, especially from Europe, but also from American Jews, perhaps in stages, a half aliyah at first. But I do believe that in many ways, this is a moment for us to organize, to strengthen those ties with the people of Israel, with the IDF, for them to understand that this is the most moral army in the world, conducting a war in the most moral way, despite what some of the media would like to portray. It has the lowest kill ratio of civilians to military of any battle of its kind, and so much more. You've all seen the pictures, and I know you're all informed in this regard. I was in Israel for Sukkot, and the morning after, I was asked to come to Hadassah to visit soldiers, American soldiers who were lone soldiers serving there. The first three I met, I knew their families from Dallas, from Toronto, and from New York. And each of them said to me, if you don't go down and see it, you can't tell it. And I said, no, it's not. I don't think I can. And if civilians are not going. Well, briefly, 2 hours later, I was in Sderot, and I was in Be'eri as they opened it up and collecting the bodies. And it's something I will never forget. I don't want to remember, but I will never forget. And it motivates me to work even longer hours than I do, which is almost impossible, because I feel the obligation. I saw what my grandparents witnessed in 1943 when they were deported to concentration camps. There's no words to describe the horror of what we witnessed, and the courage of the soldiers and the volunteers who came there to work on the bodies, and a young soldier who took me to a truck. And literally, I felt like I hit a brick wall. I couldn't go past it. And he pulled me past this terrible stench, and that was literally like a physical barrier. And he opened the door to the truck, and there were 50 bodies, small body bags, big body bags. And they had to deal with this day in and day out as they opened up Kfar Aza right afterwards and other places with the horrendous scenes. And in fact, while I was standing there, they caught a terrorist maybe 10 yards from me. I saw his face, I saw his gun, and yet these guys ran to the danger, not away from it, and he surrendered. So I think this is a setting for a momentous time in Jewish history, in American Jewish history and world Jewish history, as much as is Israel's history. We have to look at this perfect storm that we're caught in, the domestic rise of anti-Semitism here and around the world, that Jew hatred has become so commonplace, manifest in new and different ways virtually every day. And this is not the time to go into all the details. But when we find our colleges becoming hotbeds of anti-Semitism, that not the classrooms, not the libraries, not the dining halls are safe places for Jews anymore, that faculty today are reporting as much anti-Semitic actions against them as students did. And it's across the board. There's virtually no institution that hasn't reported it. And we have lawsuits in more than 20 universities in the works or happening already because of the discriminatory actions and the failure on the administrations to protect the rights of Jewish students. But it's not just the colleges. Now we're finding it in high schools, public high schools, where the Qataris have paid for clubs for the last decade, where they have maps, huge maps without Israel on it, and it only says Palestine. And one superintendent that I spoke to said to me, well, we had it there for 10 years. Why now? I said, for 10 years, you educated these kids in hate, no matter when they get that. No wonder they get to campus, they feel the way they do. But it's not just the high schools. We're now finding it in kindergartens, in public schools, and funded. And we have documentation. There's a curriculum you can find called Woke Kindergarten, where they're teaching anti-Israel's hatred to little children. You know, the Catholic Church says, give me a child till he's 6, you can have him the rest of their lives. What's happening in those kindergarten classrooms is going to affect them all of their lives. This is not just a passing phenomenon. And the reason I say this is because it is going to impact U.S.-Israel relations. It's going to impact our ability to mobilize young people and to understand what the depth and breadth of the anti-Semitism in America, let alone what we've seen in Europe, and the increases every year in the number of anti-Semitic attacks. And it is no wonder we have traced already between $6 and $10 billion in Qatari money to universities, just Qatari. And there's also Iranian, there's Chinese, there's Russian, and there's Turkish money, all of them hostile to us. They are all mobilizing and poisoning the minds of young people. And we found a direct correlation between foreign funding and increased anti-Semitism, also hostility to other groups. But this is important to understand why we're witnessing what we are, how this has been infiltrated into every aspect of our universities and our intellectual life, and even now into business and other sectors. You cannot look at what's happening to Israel without understanding this and seeing how the media has covered the events of the last months, the distortions about Israel, misrepresentations, which puts an onus on us to tell the truth, to make sure the message gets out, especially about the IDF conduct, and especially in light of some of the comments that are being made, even from some public officials. Thank God, Congress remains overwhelmingly with us. The American people, despite the headlines, remain in every poll remarkably with us. It's true amongst young people. There is a diminution, and it's something that we have to address. But when they so distort things, even denying some of the realities, when 25% of young people don't believe October 7th happened, when 20% don't believe the Holocaust happened, when we see how UNRWA is defended by many people, even after now this discovery underneath that UNRWA headquarters, and they were paying the electric bill for the Hamas command center underneath their headquarters and denying that they knew about it now. The fact that a lot of the media are saying, well, it's an allegation, it's not proven. It is proven. There are pictures. And it's only one example of so many where Israel has demonstrated the facts and the media is distorting it. It is remarkable to me how many of the American people still stand with us. We have to strengthen that. We have to constantly work at getting the message out. And that's why calls like this are so important, to deal with factual issues that so many people are misguided deliberately, some of them motivated by hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews. And even when public officials start talking now and putting pressure on Israel about the day after and about the protection of life, there's no army in the world that goes to the length that does, and more morally than the Israeli army. And we are rewarding those who carried out the outrage, the massive evil of October 7th, if we reward them with the objectives of establishing a Palestinian state. Maybe that should happen at some point. But to say that that should be an outcome now is a mistake. They haven't proven they're ready. They haven't demonstrated one thing, that they will take responsibility. Is there any reason, they say the definition of insanity is repeating things over and over again, expecting a different outcome. Well, why would it be different now if we don't establish clear guidelines, clear standards that have to be met, and let Israel complete the job? I can tell you that every Arab leader that I've spoken to tells me, don't listen to the public statements that we make. You have to decimate them, finish them, because if not, all of us will be in danger. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they all understand that if Hamas, the cancer, is allowed to come out of this and claim a victory of any kind, they don't care about what happens to the people. They never did. You see how all the money was spent. You see 500 miles of underground tunnels. So they never cared about the Palestinian people. They don't care about it now. And their patron saint, Iran, does not care about what happens to Palestinians in Lebanon or in Gaza. They don't care what happens to Lebanese. They don't care what happens to people in Yemen. They have an agenda. It's driven by a radical extremist Iraq agenda that even its own people reject. The majority of Iranians today reject their government, and they demonstrate in remarkable ways, and something unfortunately does not get reported. The moment of silence for Palestinians, tens of thousands of people blow whistles and stand up and cheer and yell, and their chant is, we won't die for Gaza, we won't die for Hezbollah, we will die for Iran, and even called for death to the supreme leader. They're doing courageous things, and the demonstrations continue there, but they're not reported. You see how Iran has established a network from Yemen to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Iraqi and Syrian militias to encircle Israel. And that poses a threat to the survival of the regime in Iraq, to any government that doesn't toe the Iranian line. Therefore, Israel is taking the fight on for all of them. And if we send the wrong messages, if we send a message to our Arab allies that we do not stand by our friends, and America has, and I think it's remarkable with the ammunition shipments and the statements at the UN and many other things. But every once in a while, things are slipped in which undermine that. If they undermine the confidence people have in America's commitment, and if they diminish Israel's standing and then raise the expectations of what the outcome and what the day after will look like, it is something that will have to be addressed. And the government of Israel and the people of Israel will have to deal with that. But I know this is a bit long, but I just want one last thing, and that is, I believe that the Abraham Accords will survive. I believe that the intentions of many of the Arab countries to build high-tech cities are dependent on Israeli technology, and they want to do it with Israel. And I can tell you that they depend on Israel to help stabilize the region by facing down Iran, because none of them will do it alone. And all of them talk to me about the permanent aircraft carrier that Israel is and why Israel is so important. So we have to send that message. And it means we have to talk to the media, to talk shows, to our Congress people, our elected officials at every level, not to permit the continuation of the distortions and misrepresentations, to stand up for our children, for their education, for the manipulation of our governmental processes. This is a critical time. And how we respond is going to determine what will happen to the Jewish people for many years to come.
Malcolm, thank you. Really, thank you for it packing into 15 minutes, literally hours of thought and analysis. If I could ask you a couple of points that you briefly spoke about. You personally have incredible relationships with many, many Sunni Arab leaders. You have a relationship with Erdogan. You've actually, at the behest of the American government, you've met with Assad. So you know that world, you've dealt with that world for a number of decades. If you could elaborate upon what you were sharing with us, the mentality, the perspective, particularly amongst the Sunni Arab nations, but also if you can bring in Turkey and bring in some of the others, how they perceive what's happening here, where they're at, what they're saying behind closed doors to America, what they're saying behind closed doors to the West about what's happening both on the southern front of Israel and the northern front of Israel.
So you're asking a very profound question because it's something that is misunderstood, because often statements are made by those governments because they feel they have to, not because they want to, and not because it's things they believe. I can tell you that amongst the major Sunni leaders have said to me, if I asked my people to name the top 50 issues of concern, the Palestinians wouldn't make it because they feel it's a kleptocracy, that they poured tens of billions of dollars and now see how it went into concrete for subterranean tunnels, not for hospitals, not for any of the other things, and into the pocketbooks of the leaders of Hamas who became billionaires, as we saw in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority, where all the money, much of the money and much of the aid gets taken, is then sold or used only for the elites of the Hamas in Gaza or for the authorities in the West Bank. So we have to know that this image of universal support for the Palestinians, maybe now because they're seeing the daily pictures, it has aroused emotions and different attitudes, and we have to recognize that, because you have the steady diet of Al Jazeera's distortions, lies, misrepresentations, and the rest of the Arab media, which they see, is likewise, by and large, very hostile. There are a few that have balanced presentations by bringing on people every once in a while who will tell the other story. But overall, the images that they're getting, and the images the American people get overall, look at the headlines in the New York Times and other papers. Look at the media coverage. You can't believe that it's the same places that we're looking at, and where we see the videos telling the truth of what happened. And you see how Israelis have gone out of their way to protect people, and could have easily carpet bombed the whole place. But unfortunately, their holding of hostages prevents it. And because Israel doesn't do it, they had to go apartment by apartment there. I spoke to the guys in Gaza, and they were describing to me how every house has rocket launchers or could have them. Every apartment could have them, and they have to dismember them and take them apart. And they find such huge quantities of equipment. And in the Hezbollah land, every third house is a rocket launcher, has rocket launchers in it. And all of this in violation of UN resolutions that are supposed to keep them north of the Litani, and yet nobody feels that is a necessary requirement. So in much of the Sunni world, they look to Israel to take on the terrorists that they fear and that they know will come to visit them. Houthis didn't start firing on Israel first. They fired at Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia crumbled in the face of it and has not responded, as has Britain and the United States and France and others, to the challenge, which is crippling shipping in the Red Sea, driving the price of goods up 10 or 15%. Even the Chinese now have to protest because their shipping, they thought they'd be immune to the impact, but are not. And the Houthis are a good example. They could be crushed easily. America has been bombing, and they've been taking out restricted, isolated targets. But with all of that, with the British and American planes, and with the onboard anti-missiles being fired at the Houthi rockets, we still haven't defeated this pipsqueak army, and in the poorest country in the world. So when they look at Israel facing something that has been entrenched and financed to billions of dollars over the years, we understand what a tremendous challenge Israel faces. So one is that don't believe just the statements of the Arab leaders that are often quoted. Certainly not the Gulf leaders, not the Central Asian Muslim leaders. Often they tell me that they have to be worried about the street. Well, the street by and large, doesn't care so much, except it gets excited. And you have Iranians who have infiltrated not only in the United States, including across our southern border, but in most of these countries, there are populations of Shia that have entrenched themselves and then make their voices heard. Governments there fear their stability, and so therefore have to act in accordance with that. I think overall, the sentiment is clear. Now, Erdogan is a unique example, and you know that I meet with him 3-4 times a year. He is mentally not always balanced. He is, that's a kind way of putting it. He's someone who told me once, when I won't go through the whole exchange because it take too long, but it led to my telling him that to be a responsible citizen, one of the things he had to do was to stop paying for the riots on the Temple Mount. He paid for them. And he said to me, "How do you know I paid for them?" I said, "You know and I know, so let's not go there." And he said, "Okay." And then he went on to give me a description of how they controlled Jerusalem for 400 years and they know how to keep peace, meaning Suleiman, between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And then he said, the bottom line is you can't be the caliph without Jerusalem. It tells you his megalomaniac approach to the region. Other Muslim leaders, leaders of Muslim countries, talk to me about him. They know he's not stable. They're scared of him. He's building thousands of mosques around the world. He sends a message every Friday what they can preach. He is Muslim Brotherhood. He always was, always will be. There are times when he tamps it down, when it serves his purpose, but that is the bottom line. They're facing an election in Turkey this year, as well as in Iran, local elections. And so that also affects the actions that some of them take. I can go country by country to say, look at the Iraqis want to get rid of the Iranians. I think even Syria wants to get rid of the Iranians, although they supported him, Assad, and he feels indebted to them. But the Russians don't want to see the Iranians gaining foothold. Certainly Turkey also doesn't, but each one is a counterbalance to the other. In Syria, which is an unstable place where you have a large militia, Iranian militias present, and you see, despite thousands of attacks by Israeli planes and some by Americans, hundreds by Americans to stop the shipment of sophisticated weapons, they continue. So by Iran to Syria and militias, but most of all to that, through them to Hezbollah, where you have 150,000 missiles. The answer is that this is a regional problem, and a regional solution will be necessary, but it hinges on the outcome right now of what happens in Gaza, that Israel can emerge from this and declare a victory. It doesn't have to be, the total victory. If they get Sinwar and others out of the country, if they dismantle Hamas, if they can establish a meaningful government of some kind, interim regime, even until the people have a real election. And the same thing on the West Bank, not the PA, and rewarding all of them now by demanding a Palestinian state and saying everything has to lead to it now. We can't even define it. Nobody knows what it would look like. And it's a mistake to reward them for a lack of performance. Test them, make them perform, show them that they'll rein in the terrorists, show them that they will go after all the factories in Tulkarem and Jenin and all these other places and act responsibly. Then they can talk about expanding their role.
Malcolm, would you share with us, it's also a very difficult, complicated topic, your assessment, your analysis of the Qatarians? They play both sides of the fence. They're the ones who've created a hatred through Al Jazeera. On the other hand, America has a naval base there, has a military base there. It's a complicated situation. And if you could elaborate for us, for those who are participating on this briefing, where the Qatarians have value, where they've caused tremendous problems for Israel, for the West, where you think the Western policy is going towards Qatar, and where you see Qatar, let's say, in 3 or 4 years from now. If you could elaborate on that.
Okay. So I started going to Qatar 30 years ago, and I brought a delegation then of the Presidents Conference after I went myself. We got red carpets on the streets when we came. They welcomed us openly. They enabled us to have the kosher meals for the delegation. And it paved the way for Shimon Peres to come and visit, and then to establish the interest office, which was the first that lasted for many years in Qatar. We did some things for them as well. And they were certainly pointing to breaking the glass ceiling of relationships with Israel, even though there have been quiet relations between other countries and leaders. But this would be the first time that there was this open reception for Shimon Peres and the other activities. Then there were changes in the government, and they moved towards hostile positions. In the meantime, American universities were established there, and Jewish communities helped, and Jewish individuals who were on the boards of these universities helped because they thought that the American presence would modernize the societies and moderate these societies. As you know, we had good news this week that Texas A&M has pulled out of Qatar, is pulling out of Qatar. It'll be over a couple of years. But the president of Texas A&M called me and told me about the board vote shortly after it happened and their commitment to withdraw completely. And as you know, there's nuclear research at Texas A&M here, but also some nuclear research non-weapon there. So this is really an important breakthrough. And now we should demand that the other universities, American universities, do the same thing and pull out. But you're right, there's a big base there, which they hold over us. And Qatar has helped in providing funds to Hamas, which so that Israel doesn't have to, and also exercise some leverage. But as we see, it also didn't provide the supervision over how the funds were used and continues now to host the leaders who live in immense luxury. And I've met people in Qatar, leaders, including Dahlan and others who live in the lap of luxury. Qatar is taking a more and more extremist view, a Muslim Brotherhood view. They are closely tied and intertwined with Iran. And I think while they were seen as serving a useful role overall, I think today it's perceived as a negative role. And all this time, they invested perhaps $300 billion in the United States. They own huge swaths of real estate. They own industries. They will be able, when your question about what will their role be in a couple of years, they can exercise a lot of influence based upon their investments in the United States, direct and indirect, the influence that they can exercise in the universities to which they have given money. And in the course of that, also directed the faculty who gets appointed. And as I said, they get batches of scholarships to give out. And you can be sure they're sending the students that will do their bidding, not the best academic students. So the Qataris, I think, are it's a small country. I think it's 330,000 real citizens, real Qataris, that's punching way above its weight, but able to devote this money in the United States. But it's also investing money in Europe and other countries. So you can see the vast wealth that they are investing and the leverage that it gives them. I think there has to be restrictions. The Congress has to demand that universities disclose all the foreign funding. I think it should be taxed as well, but at least right now, disclose it, talk about what the influence is. They have tried to seconder all this information. They have not filled forms that they're supposed to file with government. And I think it's really time to do it. And businesses should disclose Qatari investments. And we should sanction those who aid and abet terrorism in Qatar and in any other country where it's taking place.
You're not very optimistic that the Qatarians are going to moderate. You're not. You don't seem to be very optimistic.
The Qataris will do whatever. The Qataris, like others, are pragmatic. They'll sell to the highest bidder, whatever's in their interest. Some are driven by ideological and extremist religious ideology. Erdogan, for instance, is a Muslim Brotherhood extremist. Others are, and I think the influence that they exercise is outsized, and they find within preachers and others that they send around, including to the United States, so that mosques in the United States that are paid for by Qatar, by Turkey, by others, are preaching extremist messages. And I know it's very sensitive and we believe in religious freedom and all of that, but we cannot have them turn America into the kind of base for hatred that we see in Europe, where churches are being turned into the mosques in hundreds in each year, and they become then the base for radical imams to preach and to excite the population and turn them to even to violence. The United States is not immune to that. So I am optimistic that if we look to the people of Iran, 90% of whom oppose this regime, and the vast majority support Israel, remarkably. But the same is true, I think, if you get to the people, they just want to lead decent lives. They want to be free of the yoke of restrictive lives. The people who threw off the burqas in Saudi Arabia or in Iran and even in Turkey. And now you see how a lot of the extremists are reemerging. Erdogan is in real trouble in the next election. I think that people ultimately want to have more democratic regimes, maybe not democratic by our standards fully, but it will converge to that. And they look to Israel as a model. They see all the development, economic development, the standards of life in Israel, and they say that's what we want, including the Palestinians. So we have to push democracy in the region. We have to hold governments to account. We have to use the sanctions more effectively. We should bomb the Iranian oil fields. I don't want to see people die, but there are ways of hurting. They're getting $1 billion every 8-9 days in income from oil. We have to stop it, and we have to impose more and more sanctions. They do work ultimately.
One area that maybe is a little more optimistic or positive, if we could ask you to elaborate, it's something you brought up, that if America continues to support Israel, both in Gaza and if necessary up north against Hezbollah, and with the support of the Sunni Arab nations, with the support of other Western nations, Israel is able to do the job that ultimately will not just protect Israel, but will protect Western civilization. It will protect the world from the Shia caliphate based in Iran with their 6 proxies of the revolution. If that's the case, and then the Sunni Arabs see that Israel, number one, is strong, that Israel is the only one that's willing to stand up militarily to Iran, that Israel is their protector, making all of those assumptions, which I think are fair assumptions. If you could elaborate, you'd mentioned that you're optimistic not only Saudi Arabia, but a number of other Sunni nations will probably join eventually the Abraham Accords and ultimately partake of Israeli technology, of Israeli know-how to expand the Abraham Accords into many areas, economically, politically, intellectually. Could you elaborate how you see things and where you see it going?
Absolutely. It's a great question and phrased right. As you know, I had a thing called Abraham Spirit, which I initiated several years ago because I really believe that if we don't move forward with the Abraham Accords, despite COVID and some of the other restrictions, we will move backwards. And that in my discussions with leaders in the Arab world, I see that the opportunities that exist, there are difficulties sometimes. So what I proposed was not to focus on diplomatic relations, which you negotiate for 2 years for a piece of paper that has little impact afterwards, but instead to move forward with economic cooperation, with doing joint development and projects like the railroad that they're talking about that would link Israel, Saudi Arabia, all to India and elsewhere, to talk about water reclamation, which Israel has expertise, to talk about, and desalination, to talk about post-harvest reclamation, so many of the things, let alone the energy, and to go to countries like and get individuals in countries like Pakistan and Malaysia, Indonesia, despite the governments being very hostile. I think, and I know that there are many, some have even visited Israel and have established ties with Israeli companies. But if we show the people the benefit that can emerge from it, if the Saudi people see projects actually happening, diplomatic relations will follow. And many of the countries of Central Asia, the Sunni countries and Shiite countries like Azerbaijan is a Shiite country, but it's a modern, more moderate, in fact, even almost secular Islam state that where Jews live freely and have for 2,600 years, as they have in Kazakhstan, as they have in Uzbekistan, especially in Bukhara and other places. And you can create an arc that goes from the Mediterranean, where we have the Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and the Mediterranean Initiative, which we began many years ago, but take that arc all across to Saudi Arabia and bring in the chambers of commerce, not the foreign ministries, and show people the vested interest, do cultural exchanges, do all sorts of tourism projects, other things that bring people-to-people contact, that build up those in those countries that are truly looking to have a more enlightened approach. And I believe that in time, that will strengthen Saudi Arabia's ability to sign the paper because they see many other countries, Muslim countries, coming into the fold. Many African Muslim countries want to be part of it. I can tell you that we've been approached, and so that there could be three centers: one, the Mediterranean Center from Morocco to Egypt, then the Gulf Accords, and then the Abraham Spirit countries, which will go all the way to India. Even Korea and Japan have asked to be part of it. There's unlimited potential. And unfortunately, COVID put a real crimp in it, but so did now the war. But I think that the potential remains and that we have to exploit it.
Please feel free not to answer this question if it's too sensitive. You mentioned a number of countries. Could you mention some of the countries that you see eventually, whether they be African countries, whether they be Central Asian countries, that could join the Abraham Accords and could have serious relations with Israel? We all know Saudi Arabia. What were some of the other countries?
Well, I mentioned the Central Asian ones. I know that Georgia is already, and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and some of the other, Tajikistan, have diplomatic relations. Certainly, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan have close relationships with Israel. They want to expand those relationships. They want to establish the C4+1 with Israel. And then if you look beyond it, there are businessmen in the countries that I mentioned, some of which I mentioned, in Malaysia, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, who want to have relations with Israel. But we need to create a framework where they can take practical steps and where we can show the benefit to these countries. And then many African countries, and I can tell you even some of those that now have more extremist regimes, want to. Morocco has been courageously sustaining its relationship with Israel. And despite the pressures, the internal pressures, they've contained the Muslim Brotherhood. They have changed their educational systems. By the way, so did Saudi Arabia, so did the UAE, so did Bahrain. Take out the anti-Semitic content, have had Holocaust memorials, Egypt as well. So there are changes that you see taking place. There are others where it got worse, like in the Palestinian Authority, worsened their textbooks. Qataris did not change them, but many others did. And we see African leaders in Muslim African countries, major ones, that are looking to build relationships. And by the way, also non-Muslim countries. But you can get Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, so many, Ivory Coast, I can go through Togo, all of them, one by one. The countries in the Sahel are looking, and if we have closer relations between Morocco and Israel, and Israel has stood up for Morocco and is committed to the relationship, and Morocco so far has demonstrated the same, that we have to assist them and not see America all of a sudden courting Algeria, which is working with Iran, which is working to undermine Morocco, which is promoting Islamism in the Sahel. We sometimes have short-sighted policies and not look at the investments that we have to make. They're not looking necessarily for foreign aid. They want support. They want recognition. They want statements of support. They are it's all within the realm of possibility of what we could do. And all of these things will yield economic benefits, but political benefits, even more importantly, to the West, to the United States, to each other. And I think the Mediterranean can be a stable region if we properly invest from Morocco, Spain, Bulgaria, Romania, Malta. All of these countries, and Greece and Cyprus and Israel, have formed the nucleus for this. And it was, there was a time when they didn't speak. When we started going there with Greek leaders, they weren't talking to each other, the governments. And now they are working together in every area. Look at all the defense cooperation, the economic cooperation, the joint efforts in the Mediterranean and exploration of energy. All of these potentials exist elsewhere as well. But the United States is a major player. The Europeans are a major player. They all have to get in line, look at this with open eyes and realistic expectations, not succumb to the pressure of the extremes within their own political realms, and institute policies that will long-term support and secure all of our freedoms.
Malcolm, thank you. You are a servant of the Jewish people, a servant of humanity like no one else. And in a humble, quiet way, you've developed relationships over 5 decades. And those relationships are deep, they're profound, and we thank you for being our leader. We thank you for being someone who's educated us, who's mentored us, who's guided us. And it's just it's a blessing and a pleasure to learn from you, to ask you questions, and to know that you are a friend of the IDF. And you're someone who's always looked after the soldiers. You've cared about the soldiers. And we can't thank you enough, Malcolm.
It's I who have to thank you both for the opportunity, but for your support. I know you've done a remarkable campaign for the soldiers, and there's the caring and concern that people are showing. And this is something we have to look at long term. It's not a one-year commitment, that we have to help the families, to help the wounded, to help those who are suffering post-trauma. There's so much that is going to be needed that all of us, for our own sake, should make sure that the wherewithal is there so you can carry out these important missions.
We can't thank you enough. Wishing everyone a wonderful week. Thank you.